this free video tutorial from mographplus.com. Make sure to visit our website and check out our premium courses for Cinema 4D, 3ds Max, Arnold Renderer, MAXtoA, V-Ray, and much more. And also make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hey folks, welcome back to mographplus.com. It's Khazri here with you. One of the headline features of MAX 2018 is Arnold for 3ds Max or MAXtoA, and in this video tutorial we are going to be taking a quick look at Arnold and the general workflow when working with Arnold for 3ds Max. So I'm going to give you guys just how to work with the lights, with the materials, how to set up your final render and stuff like that. Also make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Vimeo, because we're going to be having a comprehensive introduction to Arnold for 3ds Max course in about a month or so. So by the end of May, we should have our comprehensive introduction to Arnold for 3ds Max course ready. Now, the first thing I want you guys to do is to go to Solid Angle website and download the latest version of Arnold for 3ds Max plugin and install it in your Max 2018. So you don't get any weird bugs and problems. Okay, the scene we have, as you can see, we have this simple studio setup with some basic objects. So let's try to create some lights, create a few maybe shaders, and set up our final render after that. In the render settings, make sure your production render is Arnold. And in the common tab, let me just set up a quick HD resolution like 800 by 450. And in the active shade mode, make sure you have Arnold as your render again. And let's set up the same HD resolution. Perfect. Now, I'm in active shade mode, as you can see. Now let's create an Arnold light. So from the create panel, go to the light tab and select Arnold. And as you can see, we have this one single option called Arnold Light. And if you click this, you can see you can define and specify the type of light that you want in the light settings. So right now, and by default, it's set to quad. So we get a basic rectangular area light, which is the most common light type when we work here. So let me go to maybe the front view and create the light maybe here. Okay, so that's our first light. As you can see, we have an Arnold light with its target. Let me just select both of them and go to the top view and position them maybe something like this. Okay. Now let's select the light itself, and in the modify panel, here you can control the size of the light, you can control the color intensity, and basically everything related to the light. And the size is 100 by 100 centimeter, which is good. Let me just move the light. Let me select its target as well and move it slightly to this side. Now we can create a physical camera. So let's go to the camera tab, standard, physical, and in the top view, let me create a simple camera. Press C to go inside that camera and look. Shift F to have our save frame. Now let me select the light and run the active shade to see what we have. So this is what we get by default. Now what I want to do is to actually apply an Arnold standard shader to all the objects in the scene. So let me go to my material editor, and if you right click in the materials tab and Arnold, here you can have all the Arnold materials, and from the surface section you have this standard surface material, and this is basically the Uber material, the shader or the material that is capable of producing all types of shaders and materials and plastics, metals, refractive materials, and everything. Now let's go to the Specular Reflection section and For now, I don't want any reflection, so let's zero out the amount. Also, we can stop the active shade so we can actually take a look at the preview that we have here. And the base color is 0.8, the value, and we zero out the specular reflections for now. That's good. Let me select the studio objects and also select the objects in the scene and assign the material. And now we're gonna be taking a look at this material later on in this lesson, but for now let's run active shade and take a look at the Arnold Light. Obviously you can turn on and off your light. You can specify if the light has a target or not. You can specify the type of light that you want. You have a point light, a distant light, a spotlight, a quad light, a disc light, a cylinder light, a skydome light, an IES light, a mesh light. So you have access to all sort of light types here. You can control the size of your light, and down here, if you come down in the color and intensity section, you can control the intensity and the color of your light. Now in the intensity section, you can see we have two values. One is the intensity and one is the exposure. Exposure is basically a value based on f-stop. So when you increase the value by one increment from 8 to 9, for example, you are doubling the amount of the emitted light. And the intensity is maybe a bit more sensitive, so you can go ahead and it's a bit more generic value compared to the exposure. And I tend to use exposure to control the overall intensity of my light. And if I wanted to have a bit more detailed control on my light intensity, I use the intensity value. For example, if I want to go to 1.2, for example, I use the intensity. But if I wanted a bit more drastic change, I use the exposure value. In this case, let's use 1.9 for the intensity and 9 for the exposure value. And obviously in the color section, you can specify the color of the light. Okay. Use a preset or use a Kelvin value, which I tend to use it most of the time. In this case, let's use a value like 4000, so we have a warmer color for our light. And in the sample section, here is the value that actually controls the overall quality of the light. So as you increase the samples value, you are going to get less noise in the areas that are directly affected by this light. We are going to be taking a more in-depth look at the samples and how to control the noise in your scene using Arnold in this lesson. Just for now, increasing this value will result in less noise produced by the light source. You can control the shadow, whether the light casts shadows or not, the color of the shadow, the overall intensity. And down here you can control the contribution of the light for different ray types. For example, if I actually get back to my material and have the specular reflection back to 1, so we get some reflections in our shaders. Right now the diffuse and specular contribution are set to 1. If I zero out the diffuse, you can see the light only affects the specular reflections, and if I zero out the specular reflections, the light only affects the diffuse rays basically. And you have indirect rays for controlling how the light affects the GI or indirect rays, right? And these were basically the most important features and parameters of Arnold Lights. Let me quickly get back to the standard surface and zero out the specular reflections for now. Okay, now the next thing I want to do is obviously to add another light to the right side. So what I'm gonna do is go to the top view. Also, let's lock the current view that we have. So let's lock the current view. Now in the top view, let's select the light and let's shift drag it to the right side. Okay, as a copy. Now for this light, what I want to change is its Kelvin value. So let's have a nice balance and use a value like 12,000. and now we have this beautiful balance, and I don't think I want to change anything else in this case. And finally, let's add a third light on top. So let's select the light, our second light maybe, and let's hold down Shift, and just some problems here, so let me make sure this light doesn't have any target for now, and rotate it. Okay, there we go. Maybe something like this, maybe a bit higher. Also, let's go maybe smaller light size, 120 centimeters, and also let's decrease its intensity maybe to something like 8, and use a simple white color as its overall color. Okay, now let's wait for the active shade to finish the render for now. So here is what we have. As you can see, it's a pretty good looking render. We might need to adjust the obviously resolve the noise issues that we have, but for now we can go ahead and maybe take a look at the lighting that we have. So that's our here is our first light, and then we have our second light on the right side and a top light as our third light. Okay, now the next thing I want to do is to just use a simple grid texture on the backdrop. So in the material editor, this is our main standard surface. Let me shift drag to create a copy and select the studio objects here and assign this standard surface. Now if I right click here, you can see we have our material and our map section. Arnold supports some of the 3ds Max native maps and texture, like the bitmap for example, and Arnold itself has tons of maps and math maps and texture maps. So in this case we can use an image, or you can use a 3ds Max bitmap. Let's use an image node and actually load a texture for our backdrop. In this case I want to use this grid.png image, and also let me stop the active shade so we can see the update in the material editor. Let's connect this texture to our base color. So basically this is the base color, the main color of your shader, and we can control it with a texture. So this is our base color, and here is what it looks like. And unfortunately at the time being you cannot see the Arnold maps and texture in the viewport, and hopefully in a future release we have that. But for now, if I run the active shade, you can actually see the texture has been applied to the backdrop, right? Now let's select our main shader and go through some of the main parameters in the standard surface shader. Now let's go and start with the basic parameters section, and here you have the base color, the main color of your shader. Let's just make some space here. So you can change the color, or let's see, maybe something like that. You can control how much the base color will affect the overall material. So 1.3, this value should not exceed 1, and in this case let's use 0.8. We have the roughness. So as you can see, as I increase this value, we get a rougher surface. Then in the specular reflections, you can increase the specular value to something like 1. And now you start to get some of the reflections on your shader, as you can see. You can control the specular reflections color. So if I go to something like a pinkish color, you can see the reflection color has changed. We can make our reflections blurrier by increasing the roughness value. So if I go to something like 0.5, now as you can see, we get blurrier and rougher specular reflection. And if I zero it out, we get sharper reflections. So let's in this case use 0.1. And in this advanced section, you have this metalness and this IOR value. And metalness is basically, let me just show you if you want to create something like chrome, the way you do it is you kind of use a very dark base color, specular reflection of 1, and then increase your IOR value to something like 10. And now you get a chrome-like material. But we have this metalness value, which allows you to create metal shaders. So the way you do it, you need to have a base color, so in this case white, and then when you increase the metalness value to closer to 1, as you can see, you get this metal-like surfaces. So if I change the base color to something closer to a gold, you can see we get something like gold, or maybe something like copper. So that's how metalness value works. In this case, let me zero this out. And IR value, which is basically the index of refraction. And we're going to be taking a look at this stuff in our later tutorials. And what else? And we have this transmission value to create refractive surfaces. So if I zero out my base color and increase the transmission value, I can start to get, as you can see, refractive, transparent, glass-like surfaces, right? And you have the refraction color or transmission color if you wanted to get a colored glass or something like that, right? And now what else do we have? Obviously we have the subsurface scattering. Let me for now zero out the transmission and add the base color, and maybe zero out the specular reflections for now too. Now if I wanted to, I can add some subsurface scattering. So if I go to something like 0.2 maybe, and change the color to something a bit more maybe visible, let's increase the to something like 0.5. Now as you can see, we start to get some sort of subsurface scattering. And actually they have removed the skin shader if you are using Arnold in other packages. I think there is no skin shader. So if you want to create a skin-like material, you need to use the standard surface right now. They have worked on this standard surface shader, and they have made it possible to create really realistic skin shaders using the standard surface without having to go to the skin shader. So that's something you need to get used to if you have used Arnold in other packages. Let me in this case, so as you can see, we have this subsurface scattering going on in our objects. So let me zero out this. I'm just going to quickly really go through these options, and obviously we don't have time to go through every single option in detail, and that's going to be something that we're going to be doing in our comprehensive introduction to Arnold for 3ds Max course. So that's basically the material, the standard surface material, and obviously if you want to, you can go ahead and control each parameter with a map, right? Now let me actually, for now, let's use maybe a color like that, and also add some specular reflections with maybe roughness set to 0.2. Now let's take a quick look at some of the Arnold render settings. if I go to my render settings, the most important section of Arnold render settings is in the sampling and ray depth section. And here where you control the overall quality of your image. You can see we have the samples and this ray depth section. The samples are your noise control. So if you see some noise in a specific ray type, you come here and increase the samples value for that specific ray type, and therefore decreasing the overall amount of noise. And ray depth are basically here you can control how many times a specific ray type can bounce in the scene. So the camera AA samples are your main and the universal controller. So increasing this value will increase the overall quality of your render. You're gonna have more samples per pixel when you increase your camera or anti-aliasing samples, and decreasing this value will decrease the overall quality of your render, increase the overall amount of noise, and therefore quicker render times. And this value affects everything. All the ray types will be affected by the camera values. For example, as you can see, my diffuse samples is set to 36. And if I go to increase my camera samples to something like 6, you can see here we get 144. So the way it works, the diffuse samples, the square of this value will be multiplied by the square of the camera AA samples, and that's the value that is going to be used for our diffuse samples. Now, as you can see, we have a bunch of ray types. The diffuse is basically your GI controller. So if you saw some noise in your indirect diffuse rays or in your GI rays, you increase the diffuse samples. If you saw some noise in your indirect specular reflections, you increase the specular samples. If you saw some noise in your refractive or transmissive objects, you increase the transmission samples. If you saw some noise in your subsurface scattering, the same way, you use the SSS samples here. Now let's take a bit more practical look at how to use these values here. So if I go to my AOVs, and here is where you control your render elements, and specifically because Arnold is physically accurate and you really don't need to do anything. So when you render with Arnold and when the time comes to rendering, the only thing that you want to pay attention to is how to decrease the noise amount. So that's your only job because Arnold does the rest. Now we use AOVs to actually specifically tell where is the origin of the noise that we see in the render. So the way you do it and add those render elements is in the AOVs tab. So if I just click on this add AOV file, I can specify what render elements or what AOVs I want to see in my render. So in this case, if I just go to the built-in section, I want my diffuse, direct, and diffuse indirect, and come down to the specular direct and specular indirect in this case. And I think this would be enough for now. Okay, so let me click on this add button. Now as you can see, we have our diffuse direct, diffuse indirect, specular direct, and specular indirect AOVs. And if I want to add or remove some of these, I can simply click on this add AOV channels to the EXR file. But for now, this is what we want. Now if I render the scene right now, you can see we have access to our different AOVs, and using them we can actually specify what is and where is the origin of the noise, and therefore increase or decrease specific ray type samples and ray depth values to get rid of those noise. Obviously, as I mentioned, samples, these are the values that you use to control the noise amount, and ray depth is how much you actually want a specific ray to bounce in your scene. For example, as it's rendering, if I zero out my diffuse ray depths to 0 and actually rerun the IPR, you can see now we don't have any indirect, basically we don't have any GI. You can see we have turned off our GI, and now if I increase it to something like 1 and run the active shade again, now we introduce the GI and we allow the indirect rays to bounce only 1 time. So if I go to something like 2, now they're gonna have a little bit more room and they can bounce 1 more time, and obviously we are going to get a bit more physically accurate render. But in this case, let's set the diffuse ray depth to 1 and run the active shade again. Now let's wait for the active shade to be finished, and after that we can take a look at the different AOVs and show you guys how to get rid of some of the noises that you see in the scene. Okay, now the render is finished, and let's take a look at the different AOVs that we have. We have our diffuse direct, and this is basically our direct lighting, and if there is any noise in this particular AOV, we need to go ahead and actually increase our light samples. In this AOV and also this specular direct, you can see if we also saw some noise in this direct specular also, the origin of that noise is coming from the light, and in this case you can see the specular direct is, you can see it's quite clean, and the diffuse direct is not quite so clean. So we need to definitely increase our light samples to make sure these AOVs are cleaner, so the overall render will be noise free. And also if I go to my diffuse indirect, this is basically our global illumination pass in other renderers. So as you can see, we have quite a bit of noise, and to get rid of this particular noise, we need to increase our diffuse or our GI samples here. And we got also our specular indirect, and also as you can see it's clean, but we can maybe go ahead and actually increase our specular indirect. So if you saw any noise, you can see in this AOV, in the specular indirect AOV, we don't have the direct specular reflections of the light source. We see that in our specular direct pass. So if we saw any noise in the specular indirect pass, we need to increase our specular samples. So, but it's clean in this case, maybe we increase it a bit. Now, so diffuse direct is noisy, so let's select the lights in this case and increase the samples to something like, let's go something like 4, and our second light 2, and our third light. Now, as I mentioned, diffuse indirect is noisy. In this case, let's increase our diffuse samples to something like 4, and this should clean up this pass too. And let's also increase our specular samples to something like maybe 3 here. Okay. Now let's see what we're gonna get if we run the active shade again. So the render is finished, and as you can see, we have a pretty noise-free render. And if I go through the different passes that we have, you can see it's quite cleaner compared to our previous render. So as you can see in Arnold, even though you can go ahead and universally using the camera AA samples increase the quality of your render, but you don't do it that way. You find the origin of the noise and increase the samples for that particular ray type that causes the noise. But if you wanted to increase or decrease the overall quality of your render in one go, you can use the camera AA samples and it will affect all the other ray types and increase or decrease the overall quality of those two, but that's not a good approach. Another thing that I want to quickly talk about is image-based lighting in Arnold for 3ds Max. The workflow is a bit different compared to Arnold in other packages, so let me quickly show you how it's done. In the material editor, let's quickly add a bitmap, and let me use this HDRI called sunset here. Okay, And the process is very simple. You just need to go to the environment and effects window by pressing 8 and connect the map to the environment tab. There you go. Instance, use map. And if you actually, let's make sure Arnold is our renderer. Okay. And now if I run my active shade, you should be able to see that environment in the background and basically doing the image-based lighting for you. If I get back to my material editor, obviously you can adjust the map the way you want. So make sure it's set to environment and it's a spherical environment. Let me use a value of 0.6 for my offsets maybe, or 0 was nice. So here is our beautiful render, and as you can see, it was very simple. If I go to my render settings, you can see we have this environment, background, and atmosphere section under the Arnold Renderer tab, and here you can control the quality of the light that is basically in the environment. If it's kind of causes some noise, you can increase the sampling here. Also, we have this background backplate, so if you are trying to integrate your CGI element with a photographic backplate, you can define the environment, but you can use a different background for this image. You can specify your backplate here, and we have this atmosphere section, which I will be taking a look at in a quick moment. And also, another thing you can do if you don't want to kind of see the environment and you just want to get an HDR image to do the lighting for you, but you don't care about the visibility of the HDR image itself, you can actually use a sky dome light. So if I go to the Arnold Lights here, you can see we have this light types called sky dome, and you can specify the HDRI map here to do the image-based lighting for you and control the other features of the light right from the modified panel instead of the render settings if you wanted to. But for the image-based lighting, this what I showed you is especially if you want to see the HDR image, this is how you do it in Arnold for 3ds Max at the time being. And obviously you can control your environment and adjust it in different ways. For example, I can use an Arnold color correction node, use this as the input, and open up my environments and effects window, and instead use this color correct node here, okay, and start adjusting the map the way I want. For example, let's shift the hue a bit, and as you can see, we get a totally different result. But in this case, we don't want to do that. Another thing I want to quickly show you is how to add some atmospheric effects in Arnold. So let's first of all actually turn off all of these lights. Okay, and now let's create a new Arnold spotlight. So let's go to spots and let's create the light. And where is the target of the light? Okay, it's me. There you go. So that's our light. Let me use something like maybe 45 for the cone angle. Also, let me just adjust my camera view a bit and make sure the light is turned on. And if I run the active shade, this is what we are gonna get by default, right? Maybe go to the top view and select the light here, and maybe just move it to the left a bit. Okay, now let's add some atmospheric effects. And the way you do it is actually very simple. Also, we can maybe increase the lights exposure to something like 9. Okay, that's better. Now, if I go to my render settings, we have these, as I mentioned, environment, background, and atmosphere. And you have the scene atmosphere. So if I click on this nomad, now in the Arnold sections, you can go to the atmosphere section and select this atmosphere volume. And as you do so, now you have this volumetric effect defined in your scene. One last thing you need to do, you need to go to your material editor and actually drag this map here as an instance and increase the density to something more than 0. So let's go to something like 2.2 here and run the active shade. Now, as you can see, we start to get this atmospheric effect. It's a bit too much. Let's go to something like 0.1 and even 0.03. Okay, so now we have this beautiful atmospheric effect. And one last thing I want to do, maybe just to add some irregularity here, and let me close this. And what we can do is use what we called a Gobo filter. So if you select the light, you can actually modify your lights in Arnold, which is very cool. So if you go to your modifiers, you have this Arnold Light filters, and particularly in this case we are interested in this Arnold Gobo filter. And let me come here in my material editor and add an Arnold noise and use this as a slide map. So let's drag this here. Let me run the active shade again, and as you can see, we have the noise basically modifying the volumetric effect. And let me maybe to a scale something like 0.5, 0.5, and 0.5. So there you have it. Basically, this is Arnold for 3ds Max. Obviously, this was a very quick and not quite professionally recorded tutorial. We are definitely going to be having a lot more tutorials on Arnold for 3ds Max. And as I mentioned, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Vimeo, because we're going to be releasing our comprehensive introduction to Arnold for 3ds Max with a lot more tutorials and a more professional way of recording our tutorials like we do in our courses at mographplus.com. So make sure to subscribe to our channel, and hopefully you enjoyed and learned something. Let me know if you have any question about Arnold for 3ds Max, and hopefully I can get to them and answer you guys. So see you in the next one. Thank you for watching this free video tutorial from mographplus.com. Make sure to visit our website and check out our premium courses for Cinema 4D, 3ds Max, Arnold Renderer, MAXwell, V-Ray, and much more. And also make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel.